You know, we have seen a tremendous amount of restraint on behalf of the protesters. I mean, a
Yeah.
tremendous amount.
Oh yeah.
And I think like I I'm curious from your perspective, because I also date that election, frankly, as I
Yeah.
probably wouldn't be doing this now if it weren't for that election, frankly, in
same.
2000.
Same here.
I would still be doing, sitcoms or whatever it was at this point. But that election basically just, I think, sort of sealed the deal for me. But I've been thinking about protests over the course of those 20 years, and maybe going back to the WTO protests in 99
Yes.
in Seattle,
Yes.
but which was an amazing thing to have happen because there was no social media. We did have the internet, but it was mostly dial up. I mean, but it was the first, I feel like, internet driven a protest. And it was quite large, relatively speaking, for that time. I don't know if it was like 20,000 people or maybe a little bit more, but that was quite a bit.
Oh yeah.
For downtown Seattle.
Well, and more than the size, it was super assertive too.
It was very, very assertive.
Yeah.
And it was, I think, like more, it was more anarchists and people who I think like it was but I feel like everybody showed up. And the way the protest has evolved over the past 20 years, there were people protesting at George Bush's inauguration, but they were hidden behind bleachers.
Yeah.
And you could not see them, and the news did not report on them at all. And then we had massive protests, the size of which I don't think we've seen, over the Iraq War.
Yep.
500,000 people in New York City, similar numbers in Washington, D.C., in L.A., around the world, millions of people protested, barely any news coverage, and they were one-offs. Like, we would do one maybe every 2 or 3 months or something like that.
Yeah, you remember.
It wasn't until Occupy where things became sort of rolling in some way, like where one protest would bleed into another, or you'd have night after night. And what we're seeing now feels like a combination of all that experience.
Yes.
And that they could not have happened were it not for that. I just want to get your sense of if that's the way you've experienced this.
Thank you so much for raising that continuity and that arc. There's actually a story out in USA Today about that arc, quoting me in a certain sense of how these different movements relate to each other and the differences between protests then and now. One piece you seized on, you talked about the internet being different now than before. And, it goes in both directions, because on the one hand, the internet gives us more access to information, and it theoretically could connect us. Unfortunately, the corporate internet seems to drive us further apart. And so at the same time that it enables groups on the ground to amplify what they're doing, it brought us, for instance, the cell phone footage that's enabled the outrage around police violence to enable this political moment, right? So there's clearly value in it, at the same time that it can also be a very dramatic and problematic distraction from organizing where people are at. So it both helps us think globally, and it can distract us from acting locally. So it blows wind in and out of the sails at the same time. I think you're absolutely right to locate the Battle of Seattle as a turning point. And, among the things I'd say about it is that, what we saw there were people not just dissenting and not just showing up for performative resistance of the sort that a march is, but we saw people training, organizing, showing solidarity from steel workers to students to environmentalists, and putting their bodies on the line. When I was in law school, that was when the Bush versus Gore decision happened. I was at Stanford Law from 2000 to 2003. And so that decision happened right as I started studying what passes for law in this country. So the illegitimacy of our legal institutions for me was laid bare at the outset. It's been very obvious from the beginning of my opportunity to study law that, frankly, judges make it up as they go along. And at the moment, we have right-wing justices who are criminals themselves contriving the law as it applies to the rest of us. So the idea that we can look to the courts for any salvation from the executive branch is a fantasy. And there's so many, rabbits here I want to chase. One of them, just to riff on the court really quick, Brett Kavanaugh. A lot of people have been concerned about the court since he was appointed and confirmed to it. when I was in Washington the first time, I had a chance to fight his nomination in 2006 to the DC circuit. People, remember the history of his sexual impropriety and rape allegations, right? People don't remember he was a Bush torture lawyer. He's one of the lawyers who in the Bush administration said it was okay for the kinds of stuff that's happening around the country right now to happen. He's an executive aggrandizer. He is, potentially a fascist on the court, exactly the kind of person who we could never let near those kinds of powers, because the courts are supposed to defend us in times like this. We set up a very elaborate system of checks and balances, and we have deferentialists, accommodationists, complicit actors, and the heads of the judiciary and the legislative branch. Yep. We started talking about Pelosi. One of the reasons I'm so concerned about her, it's not just her conservatism. It's not just the fact that she's been in office for 30 years and never debated anyone to defend her record. Part of it is that she is aggrandizing the executive branch as a leader of Congress, that the institutional infidelity there undermines the Constitution. When they swear oaths of office to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic, yes, the president is one, but Brett Kavanaugh is one. Nancy Pelosi is one. You have to understand the Constitution enough to understand how it fits together. And the whole point of the Constitution is that the branches of our government are supposed to contend with each other, not pave each other's roads. And that's what Pelosi's done. Just to finish that loop on the protests, where you framed Occupy as a turning point, I'd actually locate that in the Wisconsin uprising that preceded it by about a year. Yes. And a lot of us in Occupy took explicit inspiration from the Wisconsin occupation of the state capitol.
I was out there, I think, on the last day. We did the first live broadcast I think we ever did was
wow.
There. Yes.
Right on. Thank you for doing that. I mean, it was such a pivotal era, because after that came the Arab Spring. Yes. Arab Spring activists cited the Wisconsin occupation as part of their inspiration. And here's where I just want to, expand the context with what we're actually witnessing over that arc of 20 years is a global pattern of escalating resistance. The battle in Seattle was taking explicit inspiration and solidarity with indigenous movements around the world that had long resisted corporate resource extraction. And part of the reason why we were protesting there and against corporate globalization in the years since, I was in Miami, for instance, in 2003, challenging the free trade area of the Americas, because you could see for lots of angles, climate justice is implicated here, because corporate resource extraction includes fossil fuel extraction, accelerating the climate crisis. This also implicates domestic manufacturing and labor rights. Part of the reason we didn't have any PPE, personal protective equipment, when the pandemic hit is because we've lost all manufacturing capacity in the United States, except for what happens with slave labor in prisons. And that was something that steel workers in the 90s were in the streets about. And we were in the streets with them saying, we can't outsource all the jobs. We need to have jobs for Americans too. And organized labor suffered as a result. So these mobilizations have supported climate justice. They've supported basic human rights. They've supported labor rights. They've supported domestic manufacturing capacity. It's an intersectional movement. And that, to me, is what Occupy really heralded and made clear, was that these interests aren't separate. And I heard a lot of corporate media sources, try to ding us saying, oh, the Occupy movement doesn't have a platform. Well, the Occupy movement is about to take over the United States government. That's what Bernie was. And, the Democratic establishment can organize a backroom deal to deny him the presidency, but they're not going to keep us out of Congress. And that's what our movement represents, is our campaign, at least, is an extension of those social movements into the institutional sphere. And, I told you so feels really unsatisfying, but I've warned about all the problems that we've had over the last 20 years. I said in the press in 2003 that these wars abroad are going to defund domestic social needs. Right. And, it's 20 years later and they tell us we don't have money for Medicare for all, like every other country in the world that has half the resources we do. Well, yeah, we do. We just waste it on missiles and bombs. And I could chase so many rabbits here. The F-35 Joint Strike Fighter is a thing that gets me fired up. There's a pandemic happening. There's climate chaos. There's a threat to the election if a tyrant wants not to let it happen. And we need to keep the post office open. There's 3 real threats to national security. You can't fight any of them with a fighter plane. So why are we wasting $2 trillion on a fighter plane when we need surgical masks?
We know, right? I mean, it's because the people who are going to make money off of that have the relationships, and that's it. I mean, it's just it's water flowing down, like a little hill, I guess, in that respect. I mean,
or a waterfall, more accurately.
Right, yes, and